Hey class, I'm going to be posting a few things to make up for the class that we missed. And this is just a little video where I want to talk about debt. It's one of the important economic concepts that we need to understand a little bit about the financial crisis. So the thing to begin with is that debt is probably even older than money. So money, you might know from the article that I had you read, goes back to the Greek times and the Lydian uh, kingdom, which coined like the first actual coins. And before that, people still used units of exchange, and they used precious metals, but they would trade them by weight. So if you read like the Iliad or something like that, old epic poems, they talk about talents of gold, which was a weight measure of how much treasure you would pay for a suit of armor or something like that. But from there and even before, people had a concept of owing something, of debt. And probably much more often than people sort of bartered in the sense that you might expect. So, sort of offering you one thing right there in exchange for another thing. Instead, people often had what are called gift economies. So the idea is that you don't like really trade somebody something exactly. Instead, if you have something that somebody wants, you give it to them. And then when you need something later from them, they'll give it back to you. And if you don't participate in this reciprocity, so reciprocity is when you get something in exchange for something that you give, right? There's a kind of an equal relationship. When people don't participate in this reciprocity relationship fairly, then they get condemned by society. They get sort of outcast. People don't like them, and so people sort of organize their membership in society by these systems of kind of favors and gifts and implicit debts that they have organized to set up their relationships with one another. And so this sort of relationship is very old. And then it becomes more complicated when you get the emergence of Christianity and Islam, which of course are very influential religions that had a big impact on history and on society. Because one of the big things that both Christianity and Islam agree on is that charging interest on a debt that somebody owes you is bad. It's a sin, right? So famously, Jesus threw the money lenders out of the Jewish temple, right? So he was condemning their charging interest for loans that people had given. And similarly, the Quran doesn't like charging interest on things. It forbids it, essentially. Uh, and from an economic perspective, this makes things difficult because what loans and what debt makes possible is it makes possible for people to mobilize the wealth of society. So if you have some wealthy individual or group, like so in older societies like kings and dukes, things like that, or um, people who had a lot of assets, they aren't necessarily the best people to make investments in the sense of like, you know, buying a ship or trading something or building like a factory. And factories, by the way, are old. Factories don't just necessarily mean an industrial sort of like assembly line type of thing. There used to be, sort of like weaving factories, which was basically like a building with a bunch of weavers in it, right? But any kind of productive enterprise usually requires some sort of investment. And investment is a lot easier, it's a lot more smooth when you have the ability to lend people who have a good idea the money to set the thing up. And so it really, people found ways around the restrictions on lending with interest, but it really did put a damper on things for a long time. So, for example, in Europe, for a long time, the main sort of money lenders of the society were Jews. And this was because although Jews also had restrictions about lending money at interest, they uh, had decided that these rules only applied to their dealings with other Jews. So that meant they could lend to Christians at interest. Right? And so people who needed loans in medieval Europe would probably find a local Jew. And this is, by the way, how the sort of stereotype of Jews being good with money and that sort of, sort of negative-ish idea came about, is because historically that was one of the few roles in medieval society that Jews were actually allowed and even maybe encouraged to fill. And this actually ended up getting the Jews in trouble, because if you are owed a lot of money by someone who's much more powerful than you, it's very tempting for them to get you to get rid of the debt one way or another. So that's kind of what happened to quite a lot of bankers, Jews included, over history. So in France, I forget, it was the 12th or the 13th century, the Jews were kicked out of France and a lot of their possessions were confiscated. And this was connected to the fact that the King of France was enormously in debt to Jewish moneylenders. And something similar happened with the Knights Templar later on, the King of France. The Knights Templar were this order of religious knights, sort of fighting monks who had become bankers over time, basically. And again, the king owed them a lot of money and decided it'd be easier to just destroy the order and confiscate all their assets. That seems better. Okay. So, really, kind of modern banking didn't emerge until the Renaissance in Italy. And there it was based around, these families that were engaged in sort of lending money started to get organized enough in terms of their accounting practices and in terms of the amount of money that they had available to them, that they could set up branches in different cities, and they could use letters of account where you could, if you were in Florence, say, and you needed to do some business in Rome, you could give, some money, 1,000 florins to the Medici bankers in Florence, and they would give you a letter that basically said, this guy has deposited 1,000 florins with us, and you could take that with you and go to Rome, and there's another Medici representative there, and you give him the letter, and he says, oh, okay, you can draw on that however you want here. Okay, so it was a way of avoiding the risks of traveling with large amounts of cash, and it was a way of just greasing the wheels of commerce, so to speak, because you could also potentially, if you had a relationship with the Medici, you could borrow the money from them, instead of needing to deposit it beforehand, right? If they knew that you were good for it. And so debt and instruments to offer debt were sort of developed in the Renaissance, and historians aren't sure exactly how important it was in terms of the development of the power of Europe and sort of the development eventually of like industry and capitalism and all this kind of thing. But I mean, it's clearly like a necessary ingredient in the development of full-blown capitalism, and capitalism is really important in the history of Western civilization. So, debt plays this central role. So the thing to think about with regard to debt, sort of like a question to ask yourself, is, okay, well, why is interest important? Why do you need to charge interest? And it turns out that there's a few reasons for this. Okay? The most straightforward one is, why would you bother to lend someone some of your money unless there was some benefit to you, right? I mean, yeah, if it's a friend, maybe you could lend them some money and expect to be paid back and not charge them anything. But that obviously can't be something that works between strangers and can't really be a sort of an economic basis of very much. Although, I mean, to be fair, throughout a lot of history, a lot of economic relationships have been based around sort of personal relationships. So like family bonds often, right? So a lot of like merchant families have played an important role in different trading networks in different times. But aside from just the fact that you need to have an incentive to lend money in the first place, there's also two other important reasons why you have to charge interest on money that you loan to someone. You have to have them pay you back more than you originally gave them. And one of them is the risk that's involved in a loan. So the fact is, whenever you give someone money for a period of time, there's always a chance that they might not pay you back at all, or pay you back only a part of it, or pay you back late. And all of those risks cost you money. I mean, especially literally if they don't pay you back, okay? So if you're a bank and you're lending out money to all kinds of different people, for you to stay solvent, for you to not like run out of money, you have to get interest paid to you from the people who do pay you back that will outweigh, more than outweigh, for it to be profitable for you, the amount of money that doesn't get paid back to you, right? Because if you're loaning a lot of money to a lot of different people, you know, eventually odds turn into certainties or almost certainties, right? If 1 out of every 10 people just is a deadbeat and doesn't give you back what you loaned to them, then you better be charging more than 10% interest, right? Because literally, you know, if you loan 10 people 100 florins, 1 of them doesn't pay you back, now you're at 900 florins, right? At 10% interest on 900 florins, that would be 990, so you're still behind, right? So it has to be more than 10%. And what that also tells you is that banking can really only work if defaulting is pretty rare, because otherwise bankers just go out of business, right? So risk is the first thing that absolutely requires you to pay interest, and risk is what a major contributor to what a sort of fair rate of interest would be. Fair in the sense that just to break even, the amount of interest that you have to charge depends on the risk of people not paying you back. Okay? So that's the first thing, aside from, you know, wanting to make a profit. The second thing is inflation. Over time, for most of history, and there are periods where this doesn't happen, but it's kind of the pattern. Over time, generally prices go up, right? So that is to say, to buy the same amount of goods, you have to spend more money. And what this means is that if you loan a guy, again, 1,000 florins, right, for a year later, odds are that 1,000 florins won't buy you as much as it did when you first had it, right, when you first loaned it. And so what that means is that money later is worth less than money now, okay? And as a result, you need to charge interest on a loan to at least cover the inflation that you expect over the time period, okay? So the higher the rate of inflation that you're dealing with, the higher the interest you need to charge on the loan. So these are the two main things that really contribute to interest rates. The amount of inflation that you expect to be happening and the risk that is associated with the loan. Okay? And so those two things kind of put a floor on what's reasonable to charge in terms of interest. You can't really go below the combination of those two things. Otherwise, you're really shooting yourself in the foot every time you loan the money out. Okay?